Now, a lot of what you're going to see has been drawn from the school magazines that we were just hearing about, but also one of the most fascinating things was the school kept, I don't know if it still keeps a diary, but kept a school diary throughout the whole period. And those are now also in the county archives, but they have all sorts of very interesting things stuck in, like the programmes for drama productions, lists of sporting fixtures and so on. And that is also a very useful and interesting resource. Godolphin Girls and the Great War, the comma is quite deliberate there, in that the First World War was a very significant turning point in the lives of girls, not just Godolphin girls, but all girls. And I will touch on that a bit later on. The summer term of 1914, everything seemed very good. The headmistress, Miss Mary Alice Douglas, told the girls in a rather flowery Victorian way, "There's no doubt we love life, these sunny, beautiful days, the brightest of all the year." And yet by the end of that year, only 6 or 7 months later, the Great War was the leading article in the school magazine. This is why we have so much archive material about the school and about the war. When I started working on the Godolphin archive, it was a very fascinating experience because I've looked at quite a lot of school war archives, never an all-girls school. And suddenly a picture emerges that is so totally different from what you get, obviously, at boys' schools or at mixed schools. The story of the First World War at most boys' schools is a story of unremitting gloom and doom as every month goes past and more boys were killed. Many of them only a few months after they left school. Many boys from boys' public schools went to be junior officers, and they had one of the highest casualty rates of all groups. And therefore you have these dreadful casualty lists, and you look at endless photographs of young men, 17, 18 when they were at school, and they were dead a few months, a couple of years later. In mixed schools, that tends to dominate. But looking in the archive of an all-girls school, you actually get a totally different picture, and one that I've thought was a fascinating picture, because I hardly dare say it, but you get a feeling of a tangible sense of excitement. The girls were suffering the most appalling losses, mainly of brothers and cousins, in some cases fathers, but they also had this whole world opened to them that they had never had before. And I think it's very hard to imagine how dull and how boring life must have been for a lot of girls at schools like Godolphin beforehand, because there were people at home doing all the domestic work and they weren't going to work after school. And there's a great quote that I'll show you later on, which I think summed up how dull life was. And suddenly there was a huge world opened up with opportunities to learn things, to do things, to contribute, to feel valuable, to feel you were actually making a mark in the world. And it's as I say, I hardly dare say it, because on the back of the terrible devastation and loss, it seems very inappropriate. But if you read through the letters of some of the old girls and the girls who were about to leave school with their plans, some of which were very daring for the day, you get that sense that suddenly the world was different. So this is why I call this all change, and you actually get the sense of the world changing. Mary Alice Douglas was the headmistress of Godolphin. She had been since, I think, 1890. She had no doubt about the importance of what was happening. Never before in the history of our nation has there been such a terrible war. Many people set out to fight the war as previous wars had been fought, but came up against modern technology of a devastating kind which they had not met before. And the the anguish and the loss was like something that hadn't been seen before. At this time, the early 20th century was a very important time for girls' education. In reading a book about the story of the public school system, I came across this description of education for women was regarded as a precious, almost holy gift, in that girls had had a limited amount of education. But suddenly, around that time, at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, there was a pioneering movement to educate girls in the way that boys were being educated. A lot of well-known girls' schools were established around this time, although Godolphin has a much longer history. And most of the teachers of the girls were very dedicated single ladies who took their vocation very seriously. They realised that they were preparing a new generation in a way that hadn't been done before. Godolphin already offered a wider curriculum than was available to most girls. There were the core academic subjects, but sport, drama, music, including playing external fixtures, playing concerts, even trips to Salisbury swimming baths were all on the curriculum back in 1914. Most of this continued throughout the war, although there were no away matches and there was a rather more limited curriculum of visits to places. There were some restrictions. There was no riding because horses had been commandeered. A vast number of horses, several 100,000 horses were recruited into the British Army in the first months of the First World War, along with people. There was no swimming because the town baths were needed for war purposes, and rationing caused a headache to staff in the school because all the girls' ration books were combined to produce the school food. Uniform had to change. The girls, like most school children, boys and girls, wore white blouses with these very stiff, detachable, starched collars. And one of the problems which arose in the First World War was a lack of starch. And so these were abandoned in the favour of navy shirts with soft collars. But Miss Douglas was absolutely adamant. She wanted regular, normal education to continue, while also allowing the girls and the staff to be part of the war effort. Miss Douglas was also very keen that girls at Godolphin should have as wide an experience as possible of the world around them. And it's amazing, really. I have here pictures of various events to which girls were taken. On the left there, Britain Prepared was a film about basically a film of a fleet review and various reviews of troops that was shown, and you can see there, in the new theatre in Salisbury. And I believe the girls were taken to a special showing on Bonfire Night 1914 to see a showcase almost of what Britain was fighting the war with. On the right there is a list of special films. I don't know if you can see. The girls were taken to see a series of films about everything from jellyfish in the Mediterranean to the Bay of Rio de Janeiro to the life of civet cats. And the girls were taken down to the cinema to see these films in order to try to give them as broad an education as possible. And at the bottom was the first ever visit of a tank to Salisbury. Tanks were used for the first time in the First World War. The idea was that they would replace the cavalry, and that is the first type of tank that was ever used. And one visited Salisbury, and the girls were all taken down into the town to see it. Boys' schools very quickly became overwhelmed by the dreadful losses, and everything that you see written in school magazines, in letters and diaries, reflects the awfulness of the war. Despite Miss Douglas's realism, there was a very, I think you would call Victorian attitude to the war, which actually was maintained for almost the duration. I've often wondered how this could be, and I think partly it's because most of the staff were single ladies of a certain age. their brothers and their fathers were too old to be involved. The girls obviously lost brothers and cousins, but I think because the personal losses amongst the teachers perhaps were fewer, they were able to keep up this front. And if you read some of the accounts of talks and lectures in the school, there are some really, to us, quite shocking sentiments. There was one lecture given by a vicar during the war in which he likened the sacrifice of the girls' brothers to the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, and that we must all give up our sons and brothers because the sacrifice was in some way similar to that. Certainly in the early years of the war, there's a great deal said about the glory of the struggle and the sacred duty of men to go and fight and of girls to be quiet and put up with the losses. A huge emphasis too on how, by being self-disciplined, by working hard, and again putting away selfishness, greediness, luxury, weakness, idleness and slackness, the girls could make their own contribution to what was going on. There used to be dances in school, all-girl dances on Saturday nights, and these were given up for the duration of the war, and sweets, to save sugar, but also as unashamedly as an act of self-denial. Miss Douglas seems to be very much of the opinion that the more girls were self-disciplined and denied themselves life's pleasures, the greater the contribution they were making to the war. And I thought this was quite instructive. Miss Douglas told the girls to dwell on the glorious deeds and not on the acts of cruelty. There was a very deliberate decision taken to limit how much the girls knew about the reality of what was going on. Now this was partly the general approach at the time. I mean, an awful lot of the worst things that went on were only known about afterwards because the press wasn't as it is now, and a lot of things were not spelt out in black and white. But Miss Douglas was very keen that the worst aspects of the war were not dwelt upon, and that the girls should think only of this great struggle and how they could contribute to it, what they could do most to help. And here are two other quotations from Miss Douglas. "Won't you work as never before at the things which will make your brain go stronger? Arithmetic, French, German, Latin, Greek and science. This is a call to be alert in our hands and minds and bodies, more dutiful and loving. We must read the papers and follow the maps. I've ordered the Times for all the houses so we may read the same, and the maps have been put up at school. We have a gallery of heroes too." And there was a roll of honour. Girls were invited to put the names of friends and relatives who were fighting into a kind of central record, and prayers were said for these people. And then the school's roll of honour, when there were casualties, the school had a roll of honour of dead as well. In 1914, Miss Douglas stressed her 4 watchwords, which were responsibility, sympathy, self-sacrifice and duty. I put the picture there of Godolphin girls attending Empire Day celebrations in Salisbury in May 1914. Again, there are some very interesting quotations that emerge from the school diaries and the school magazines. One of which was that the British Empire, being superior to all other forms of human organisation, must overcome the German threat, and that God had created us great to do this. There are a number of controversial sentiments like that in the diaries, which again provide a very interesting snapshot of social history at the time. I mentioned earlier how life must have been fairly boring for a lot of girls before the war. On the 27th of June 1915, a lady called Mrs Crichton, who was the widow of the late Bishop of London, came to speak at the school. She gave a quite astonishing talk for the time, which was based on how shocking it was that girls were fit to do nothing, that they didn't work in the house, there were people doing things in the house, and suddenly the war had arrived. All this work needed to be done. Girls were not fit or trained to do any of it. I'm looking forward to every girl being trained to work. No one can tell what may be asked of women. There are splendid opportunities coming, but now so many are untrained there is nothing they can do. It is important you should be amongst the workers, make a real choice of work. That is the kind of woman that is wanted. I think it's quite hard to imagine how shocking that must have been, not to the school teachers, who were very dedicated and viewed the training of girls as a vocation, but in the world at large. That's an example of actually seeing the pages of history turning. Suddenly people were aware that 50% of the population, in many cases, had not been trained to do anything useful. Miss Douglas was very keen that the girls should provide a practical war effort as well, and so the girls learnt an amazing array of skills, taught sometimes by their own teachers. In other cases people were brought in to teach everything from carpentry, gardening, bandaging and other first aid skills. Lots and lots of sewing and knitting went on. Treasure bags were made for soldiers, which were bags with a few necessities or treats in them. Tea parties were given for wounded soldiers, and there were many, many fundraising initiatives. Everything from the Red Cross through to different refugee groups. There was a lot of fundraising activity. This went on 7 days a week. The girls were doing this at weekends. In the absence of able-bodied young men, girls went out to make hay and get in the harvest. And here are two pictures from a local newspaper of Godolphin girls making hay. And there's quite an interesting account from an old girl in a letter saying how she had been working in a canteen, a soldier's canteen in France, and the soldier by chance came from Wiltshire and said that he had heard what a good job the Godolphin young ladies were doing on the land. And these are the milking medals that are in the visitors' room there. This one awarded to somebody called Hester Capel, and these are pictures of Godolphin girls milking cows just along the road from here. There are some very funny accounts of all this war work, but particularly of milking cows, of trying to get cows to cooperate. One cow that they nicknamed the Limit, because milking her was the limit. There are a lot of interesting anecdotes about all these sorts of war work. I thought this was interesting. This came actually from the Godolphin book of a history of the school, published in 1926. It contains the accounts of a number of girls who were at school during the First World War. You'll often hear people say that in wartime there's a tremendous sense of camaraderie. Sheila Dimsey, who was in the school 1915 to 1990, makes this clear. Against this dark background, the memory of a great time shines out brightly in a threefold strand of golden fun and laughter, of many-coloured beauty and strong, deep loyalty. Our fun was perhaps the more exquisite for being the reaction from the more serious aspects of life and from the enforced simplicity of its nature. The girls were having fun. There's little doubt about that. Against this dreadfully dark background, there was still fun and laughter. And what is notable is the girls got out and about quite a lot. They went on a lot of picnics and country walks. There are lots of descriptions of the beauty of the countryside and how, in a strange way, that was sustaining against the background of death and destruction elsewhere. Now, the girls, having been at school and having done a lot of this war work, many went on to continue doing a lot of the same things. There's a large number of letters that appeared in the school magazines. A number of the younger teachers were very tempted to go and do other war work. Miss Douglas actually saying that the teachers must remember how important their work was and not be blinded by the bright lights of other forms of war service. There are some very interesting accounts of girls who went on to nurse, not just in this country, but in France and even in Russia. Accounts of enormous deprivation and hardship, and these girls undoubtedly saw the most horrendous sights and dealt with the most awful casualties, but always with a good humour almost, that they actually felt they were doing something useful, which indeed they were. A lot of more mundane tasks, which had been done by men, suddenly needed to be done. So there were bank clerks and translators and people working in shops and all sorts of offices. A lot having cooked in Salisbury with the Red Cross and done tea parties for soldiers, ended up cooking and serving in soldiers' canteens. And there's a wonderful account of two girls who left Godolphin and decided that soldiers who had been injured at the front had all the medical care that they needed, but who was going to feed them? And they raised the funds to buy what they termed a mobile kitchen. And the year after they left school, so they would only have been about 18 or 19, they took this mobile kitchen to France and operated it along the line of the railway, which was used for evacuating wounded soldiers from the front, and provided simple food, hot food and stew and things like that. And again, enjoyment is probably too strong a word, but the excitement of their life and what they were doing comes through very, very clearly in their letter. And again, the life must have been so hard. These would have been two young girls, essentially on their own, because this was their own initiative, and going up and down the railway line in northern France, feeding wounded soldiers. It's a tremendous achievement, really. Others were building trucks and other war armaments, and so aircraft and trucks. People were driving. They worked in munitions factories. One girl remarked her hands were perfectly yellow from the sulphur, having made munitions and armaments in factories for months. And an old girl called Dulcie Chauncey actually became the assistant overseer at Woolwich Arsenal. So these were all areas in which only a few years before it would have been unthinkable for girls to be involved in. I love this quote. This is a girl called Keen Keeble, who worked at the Vickers Aeroplane Factory in Weybridge. I'm afraid I find it rather difficult to explain, this is what she does, as so few people seem to have heard of it. It's commonly known as oxyacetylene welding. Well, not many nicely brought up young ladies in the years before 1917 would have been doing anything like that. And just as an indication of what was going on in the background, Keen's cousin, a young man called Robert Kestel Cornish, won the MC and bar before being killed at Ypres in June 1918. I included that just as an illustration of the reality of the loss to the girls while they were at school. But Miss Douglas was, I think, quite pleased that with all that was going on, there was little chance of girls getting slack and bored at home and ready to marry the first man who comes along. Miss Douglas and her sister both remained single, and both were involved with Godolphin. And I think there was a sense of satisfaction that actually she would much rather that the war hadn't accelerated it, but that suddenly girls were out there and doing useful things. In one of the accounts of life at Godolphin in the First World War, there was huge excitement when girls had their hair cut for the first time. That up until then, most girls had long hair, which once they got beyond a certain age, their early teens, would have been put up. And in these very elaborate Edwardian type of hairdos, suddenly this wasn't practical. Girls were doing a lot of manual work, they were working outside, they were making hay, they were milking cows, and suddenly they were allowed to have their hair cut. In fact, they were encouraged to have their hair cut. And there's a great article about the comparison of each other's hair when it was cut into bobbed haircuts. And clothing became much less formal. Not only were these stiff collars abandoned, the girls had worn jackets at all times, not just in the classroom, but just walking around the building at weekends. They wore buttoned up jackets, and again, a great deal of excitement when these were exchanged for knitted jumpers. Skirts were shortened, and in some rare circumstances still, the girls or women were allowed to wear trousers because of their war work. There are some interesting pictures which are thought to be the first pictures of women wearing trousers in public, and these were women who worked on the railway line. I mentioned how the girls all went out and about and had picnics and actually had quite a lot of fun. I just included this really for reflection more than anything else. The clump, which is the clump of trees that you can see if you look out across the pitches, it just fascinates me that the clump is still there today. I was at Godolphin 1979 to 84. The clump was there then. And I think it brings it home a bit when you realise these girls were going about their business looking out at the same views that we look out on today. It gives us an idea of the continuity that runs through a school like Godolphin. All these girls we've been talking about sat here, not in this building, but in the original buildings, doing their lessons, going out, playing sport, taking part in drama and so on, as you all are now. And it's one of the things that fascinates me about archives, is that 50 years from now, what you have all been doing will be of great interest to others. And one of my biggest frustrations is I remember when I was here in 1979, 1980, being asked to take round very elderly old girls and show them round the school. And it was only after I started working on school archives I realised a lot of those ladies in their 80s would have been here at the time all this was going on. And I just wished I had been more interested and more attentive then and asked them more questions. And that is, again, a measure of the continuity of a school like Godolphin and why school archives are so fascinating, because the same things go on today, in many senses, as were going on then. And this is just a snapshot of a time, of a generation that was subjected to the most enormous pressures and the most dreadful things, and how they came through it and what they achieved during it. In the light of the launch of the Elizabeth Godolphin Award, I thought this was very interesting. Catherine Thickness, who was in Oakhurst, which later became Hamilton House, wrote about Godolphin in the First World War. Nowhere were people more consistently helped to meet both the small and the great things of life with high courage and determination to overcome difficulty and embrace opportunity. When I saw that, I thought of the Elizabeth Godolphin Award, and again, thinking of the continuity of the thread running through a school like this, that surely is what the Elizabeth Godolphin Award is aiming to achieve with the current generation. And I find that equally fascinating, that values and the aspirations of the school have actually changed very little. It works itself out in different ways, but the actual basis on which the education is based is the same today as it was then.